Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we have a simple video, something short and sweet really. I've been working on a fair bit of different types of things and different practices in the background here, and I've also been working to complete a fair few tasks and a fair few ideas as of late. This means I tend to be revisiting older ideas, and also looking at projects that I never quite came to complete, and even some that are just taking me longer than I originally thought that they would have. So yeah, safe to say that I have been doing this, that, and the other, especially when it comes to what's in the works for the moment. This drawing is certainly what I would consider as part of that pile. You see, this idea actually began as part of my last video here on the channel, which was actually thought of over a month ago by this point. You don't need to have seen that video for this one to make sense, but last time I did a 30-day art challenge where I was aiming to sketch something or to generate ideas every day off a prompt list. And I did make the prompt list myself. The end result for this was quite a pile of ideas that I would want to revisit when I'm next able to. And this was part of it. Now, this prompt in particular actually comes from day 4, where my prompt for the day had been the word flower. But over time and over the span of however long I was working on it slowly drifted more towards the idea of a forest. And I didn't really hate that. I just tried my best to keep it on track. That day in particular though saw me working on a range of ideas that really spanned a range of uses or goals and kind of a range of purposes when it came to the sketches. Some of them were for characters and others for environment is what I really mean by this. I thought that I could do a fair bit with the ideas that I came up with, and this environment is kind of the first one that I actually chose to take forward and work with at the end of it all, and it was the first one that I chose to see through from day 4. There have been drawings between now and then that I've done from the 30-day challenge, but this was the first one from day 4 that I actually took all the way through. So, without much care or much call for delay, let's just talk about the processes and the ideas at play then, shall we? So I have already covered where this idea came from, that being the 30-day challenge, but not the thought process to it, which is really the more important part of how and why I started this and took it further. It truthfully began as a bit of a mindless doodle on the day. It was something done to probably consider other options before ever taking this one too seriously, since the term at hand was flower and this was more focused on a tree. It really was just me, in a way, keeping my hands busy. All I knew when I first sketched the idea was that it was adjacent enough that I could use it to pass time between the other ideas that were a bit more on theme. And it was also simple enough that I could think about other things whilst working on it, and I didn't have to be overly invested in it. Think of it as a throwaway sketch, something to just fill the page and fill time. But then, before I really acknowledged it, this was then one of my favourite sketches from that day, and I almost had to force myself to move on from it when I couldn't do more for it in favour of those other ideas. I'd still needed to say that for day 4 I stayed on track long enough to come up with an idea that I liked. Now then, it was no surprise given all of this, that when I looked back at that file, I still liked this idea as one of the best for the theme. Well, I suppose I really shouldn't say that this was for that theme anymore. It kind of became its own thing the more that it sat there. The flowers I added on the thing to kind of keep it on theme were very quickly removed down the line, and I do much prefer it without the flowers in it. Which does kind of mean that when it's all said and done, it wasn't really for the theme of flower anymore. But either way, it was an idea from day 4 that I liked a lot and I wanted to use it as a practice at the very least. So I moved it to its own file later down the line of the 30 days, and it sat there until I finished said 30 days, and I could then happily continue away with it. At that point, it then kind of became a sort of experiment. I didn't really fuss too much over a narrative or a theme that I'd been working with, and I kind of enjoyed it more for this. I liked the very simple narrative that I had kind of been working with up to this point, and this was kind of the idea of some tiny mythical being living inside this fallen tree. And I'd also had the idea that they'd made it into a simple home for themselves. I didn't see much need to overcomplicate it from there, as it was enough information to build up a scene and an atmosphere for this drawing. I then felt that I could make choices within that frame for the drawing, and still kind of have the creative wiggle room to work with it and to create something that I liked. For example, I could have made the outside more like a little home with a light and some chairs, or a welcome mat, or anything that I really wanted to do, and I could keep it as simple as I wanted to, as fancy as I wanted to, and if I really chose to, I could have made it all look natural and quite hidden. This is basically all to say that there was nothing really dictating which way I took this route, and I enjoyed it because of the simple narrative giving me that allowance. But as it was a practice, it stayed more as a simple route, and I liked it more for this. You see, the sketch didn't exactly change between the first conception of the idea and the flat colours, so it was a fairly straightforward process. I might have just ended up removing a few branches from the main trunk of the fallen tree, just to kind of clear up the composition that little bit, and just because it didn't sit quite right within the whole framing and how it interacted with the environment. But beyond that, a lot of the decisions were made with the shading and the flat colour stage. Oh, I do suppose I tell a partial lie though. I did edit the sketch when moving it across into a new file, since I wanted this one to be a bit more landscape, and the initial sketch that I did, because I didn't have any sort of framework, ended up a little bit more on the square side. So I extended it, but that was really about it. So that then brings us into the flat colours. And again, these were very straightforward. I could have really done it in any colour. Could have made it look like autumn or a fantasy world where the plants are pink and blue. But the lively and lush impression from the green palette was kind of too fun for me to pass up this time. And kind of too fun for me to really consider much else. Now, that is also really saying something here. Normally with me, 9 times out of 10, I'm kind of looking to change the green elements in a drawing, or to try and find something a bit more fun, then settle on the green. I do naturally end up on the green anyway, but I didn't even really look at anything else this time. For once, it was my first choice, and it really conveyed that this was tucked between a bed of a forest. The green made it seem right, in a way, if that makes sense. I also did it with a natural palette to better build the feeling that this is something people could reasonably stumble across. It's mostly an idea grounded in reality, and it's hardly something miles away from other people's ideas that I've seen around and other people have had before. Little fairy in a tree is kind of a very common idea. But I wanted the natural palette to kind of help nestle it further within what we know and what we understand, just to really make it seem like this is within our world. Yes, I could have had the same idea and impression with the autumn colours, yet I think I was more in the mood for green this time. I also felt that, with all of the overlapping tones and the colours needed anyway, I felt that it would work and kind of look a bit better, and it would kind of do more what I wanted it to do if I did it with a more natural palette. The most that I did then decide to include are small hints of red and green within the windows of the house, and, a bit later, I kind of chose to shade with quite a few darker blue tones in the image, just to kind of help create a sense of interest and lighting, since a few of the colours kind of wound up pretty dark in the end. A bit darker than I intended, I will say that much. Though it was also in the flat colour stage that I chose to entirely remove the flowers. I originally had these large and bright red flowers all over the design, and it was kind of as a grab for the theme to remain present. Though all they actually ended up doing was distracting the eye from the details that I actually cared about. The flowers, whilst trying to stay on theme, were nothing more than clutter, and not even really the good kind in this context. So it was best that they just went. I turned the layer off at one point, thinking that it would only be a temporary thing whilst I worked on other areas, and then that layer just kind of never came back. Even when I was done with everything, it still didn't really need to come back. Though that is about it for the process and the colour palette, since the shading process in this time kind of sorts of ties into the beginning of the detail stage as well. Or, well, the details that I usually discuss here anyway. So let's turn our attention to that then, shall we? The first detail that kind of helped this drawing turn into this drawing is then, by this logic, the shading itself. I did do the normal methods for like 90% of this drawing, don't get me wrong, and that's more the layering colours and playing with tone here or there, undoing things, redoing it, the whole deal really. It wasn't entirely revolutionary, and I kind of did take approaches that I have done before. But this time, I think that I took a little bit more time to add little impressions in of shapes between where the light and the dark would meet. And I did do this mostly in the natural objects like the bushes and grass. In fact, I think it was only in these areas that I tried it, since these tend to be where I have the most success with this technique. I have done this in the past as well, but I then usually get caught up in the small details and then spend ages questioning whether I like it or not, or if I like it only in the moment because I've just spent however long doing them. I also then tend to view them as other objects in the image on their own, more often than not, and by doing this, it then means that I often start to look at whether I need to add shading to the shaded details, and you can probably see how I then usually end up spiralling down the rabbit hole of how much detail things actually need. In those cases, I do usually opt for the route where I shade the details closest to the perspective, really. Or closest to the camera, I should really say, as that is more how I tend to view things. And that normally means that I give the leaves that I draw in a light and a dark side at the very least. Maybe even some drawn-on lines. Sometimes I then like it, and other times these extra details make me hate it and redo the area, or remove the detail in the shading entirely. This time though, I started in the very far back area, where I simply wanted to imply bushes and nothing else. It was the detail of the leaves in that area, when done faintly enough, that really helped sell the impression of a continued forest that I was going for. It wasn't even that obvious in the end once everything around it had been shaded and detailed as well, but it was in a good way, and it was also a good way of starting the entire process. All it meant was that, when it came to later sections, I felt that I almost had to include more details of the leaves into other bushes, just to kind of help the background blend in and also make it a bit more sense. It also wouldn't have made sense if the most detail was in the background, where you're not really meant to look anyway. You'd see the leaves closer to the camera rather than those far away, so I kind of followed that logic. I am also glad that I did this, though. I think that now, if I hadn't included the leaves in the drawing, then it wouldn't have looked right, and I would have just gotten to the end of this entire thing and ended up going back in to add it all back anyway. Now, in saying that, I also found myself liking how this technique worked with the grass this time as well. It was the same process that was done with the leaves, but I also tried this approach in the Secret Garden drawing, the one with the keyhole a few weeks ago, where I added blades of grass between areas of light and dark, and I kind of used the block shading to kind of add little details to really sell the texture that I was going for. This time though, I also added in a few other tones here or there. So by this I mean I added in a few darker blades in the lighter areas and vice versa. And I still think that it turned out well. It is something that certainly has its place, one that I will experiment to find here and there. But I have found that I've been enjoying it as of late. From there though, the shading was fairly normal and quite simple. So let's look at the next detail that I want to talk about for the moment. This is the tree itself and the house details that I went for. You see, I have touched on it, but I could have added a lot more to the trunk of the tree to make it more like a house. I mean, I did debate adding in a little light by the door, maybe a mat, or something like a chair that may tell people that someone lives here. I even considered a small flower pot with a giant flower coming out of it, or a jar of fireflies next to the door. Yet I didn't really even sketch any of these. As I have already covered, the sketch didn't change much between this and when I first made the idea, but I could have maybe played with a few more ideas looking back. I think the main thing that can stop me from looking more at this was the narrative, when all things are said. I drew it thinking of someone living in this hollowed out fallen tree trunk, with the idea that whoever lives here is the one who burrowed inside. This is where the door and the window came from, two additions by whatever fancy creature lives here. I then had the idea that if I had fun with this one and wanted to take it further, I had another sketch set aside that would look more at like a fairy village. In that route, I could do a variety of things outside the houses, and I feel like I would need to give each of them their own little personality. Going down that route would also mean that I'd have far more reasoning to make those choices as well. I mean, a village has implied safety by numbers, and it's also the impression that they aren't really trying to hide too much. A village, after all, is more likely to be found than a single home, and it would be easier to kind of stumble across a larger community of these mythical beings than it really would be to find one out on their own. So that then got me thinking about what this one alone could be. It might be some outcast from the large community, or someone even hiding from one. It could also be a loner used to getting by on their own, or a few people living in the same house to get by as a smaller group. Maybe once you got into the trunk, the living space could continue down to the ground, and the trunk is simply the protective layer or the main part of the house as well, so a whole array of people could be inside. But the idea that I mostly worked with is that whoever lives here, no matter if it is a group of people or a single one, their main goal would be subtlety before all else. This is why, with all of it said, I only added a path of flat stones leading up to the door. I mean, where the path comes from is hidden in this image, so it could only be a couple of stones, or it could be part of a longer and winding path. I personally prefer the idea that this is a shorter path, that may only lead to some kind of tucked away garden, or a patch of random stones to help it blend in that bit better. But it was the only sort of personal touch that I felt would fit the intent of those living here. Now, I did, either way, allow myself the little window, since it was part of what sold the trunk as a house. The door did quite a bit, making it seem like you could go inside, but the window and the little curtains help the effect that someone is living here for the time being, since there is a kind of a bit of a personal touch more evident when you look that bit closer. Besides, even with the reasoning of trying to stay subtle and hidden, a window is about the same message as a door. If you see a door on a tree trunk, curiosity will most likely get the better, or at least it would generate some sort of question. What more could a window then do? I also simply figured that if they're hiding, they may be able to add a few windows to the side of the trunk, and if they did do that, they would have to look like details of the wood or hollows in the wood, but it would be rather hard to excuse compared to this. So if you're living somewhere, you'd ideally have at least one window to then see if it's light or dark, or one for lighting if nothing else. So whilst nothing else came to be included, I at least kept the window because I liked it. Now then, the final detail is one that I do add at the very end of this, and it ties in with one of the more earlier detailed debates. See, I mentioned that I could have included a jar of fireflies in the image, yet I didn't. So at the end, when I thought it was all said and all done, I still felt that something was missing in the image's atmosphere. I had drawn it to be at most times of day, knowing that I'd really only need to do subtle tweaks at the end to really shift it to any time of day. And I could do a lot with it. Yet, the thing that made me consider this image done had been the yellow lights that I dotted around. I imagine that they would be the subtle glow of fireflies, if nothing else, though they could also fill the role of magic if that is how it's better viewed. All I really knew is that they wrapped up this experiment, and I didn't need anything more to justify including them this time. But then again, I doubt I ever need much reason to include them, since I do tend to just find them pretty fun. And they usually do work to finish off an image, I find. But speaking of finishing touches, we have then come up to the end of this video pretty quick and kind of unexpectedly in a way. though I do have nothing else to say about the drawing, as we are finishing that off as well. Now, I do hope you've enjoyed it, as I really had fun with the quicker and simpler format for this week, and it was quite a refreshing break to experiment and try something for myself. And this was, of course, something that fit quite well in between everything else that I've been working on in the background as of late. If you have enjoyed it though, be sure to let me know. For now, have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!